Can you believe that Major League Baseball players used to wear gloves that looked like this? And now, we have players wearing leather like this on the field. It's safe to say that MLB and its equipment has come a long way since its genesis. But how exactly did we get here? Well, while the sport of baseball's origins is a hot topic of debate, we do have more conclusive evidence about the MLB's humble beginnings. Here's what we know. Prior to the MLB, baseball's first governing body was called the National Associations of Baseball Players, or NABBP. Yes, baseball used to be two words and was established in the 1860s with a rule set that spawned from Civil War soldiers playing an early version of baseball in the respective war camps. While the NABBP initially operated as an amateur league, the first all-professional team to join the association was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which was founded way back in 1869. Clearly, the Boston MLB team's nickname isn't original. But with the Red Stockings playing against amateur teams, who didn't like the fact that their opponents were getting paid while they were doing so for free. This sentiment caused the NABBP to split into two separate organizations, one for amateur teams and the other for professional clubs. As a result, the National Associations of Professional Baseball Players, which was more commonly known as the National Association, or NA, was formed in 1871. But the NA didn't last long. While it was more focused on players instead of teams, players could basically jump from team to team within the NA based on who was willing to pay them the most. A compelling league called the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, later known as the National League, or NL, sound familiar? Was formed in 1876, which aimed to develop individual teams. The NL's way of doing things proved to be more effective for baseball's development, and it soon established a few important rules that players and clubs needed to follow, such as player contracts, preventing players from jumping to higher-paying clubs, and requirements to play a complete schedule, instead of just quitting once their team dropped out of the championship contention. With these rules in place, the NL had its first game on April 22, 1876, which is often considered the official beginning of the MLB. Yet, the NL soon faced some competition, most notably from the American Association, which was beloved by fans because it allowed alcohol to be sold to spectators during games, and we can't blame them. In the 1880s, the respective winners of the NL and the American Association began playing each other in postseason championship series, which is the earliest version of the modern World Series. Then, the two leagues merged in 1892 and became a 12-team NL. But after the NL decided to drop 4 teams from the league in 1899, this led to the formation of the American League, or AL, which took in these NL rejects and created a rivalry between the two leagues that endures today. While there were still other professional baseball leagues around at the turn of the 20th century, the NL and AL soon dominated the space. The first 2 decades of the 1900s are what is now called the dead ball era because games during this time were super low scoring, largely because loosely wound baseballs didn't travel far. Pitchers could use spitballs, which makes the baseball break better, and because in 1901, the NL and the AL, 2 years later, created the 4-strike rule, where a foul ball counted as a strike, which obviously is still used today. The dead ball era came to an infamous end in 1919, which was when the most legendary game-fixing scheme in baseball history, and maybe in all of sports, took place, called the Black Sox Scandal. This is when members of the Chicago White Sox intentionally lost the 1919 World Series in exchange for a whole lot of money. While this game-fixing scandal was undoubtedly a bad development for ball's integrity, there was one major silver lining. The scandal attracted a ton of attention in the mainstream media at the time, which helped the sport of baseball gain popularity. In the 1920s, another important part of the MLB history took place, the birth of the New York Yankees dynasty. The Yankees won their first World Series in 1921, then went on to win 7 more by the end of the 1930s. While baseball lost a lot of popularity during America's Great Depression, 1929 to 1941, the city of New York's first team being so successful, and therefore popular, helped keep the game afloat during these tough economic times. So even if you're a Yankees hater, you can thank them for almost single-handedly saving the game we all know and love. World War II was another major struggle in MLB's history, as more than 500 MLB players ditched their ball clubs to serve in the military. This development made it so teams chiefly consisted of teenagers, older players, and those with a military classification of 4F, which deemed them unfit for military service. Despite this talent shortage, black players still weren't allowed to play in the MLB at this time. But that all changed in 1947, once some guy by the name of Jackie Robinson made his MLB debut for the Brooklyn Dodgers, making him the first Negro League player to play in the MLB. Robinson's playing in America's premier baseball organization had black fans flocking to Dodgers games, which slowly but surely convinced other MLB teams to follow suit. The 1950s brought another major development to baseball: the rise of relocation. 3 MLB teams moved to new cities from 1953 to 1955, but the biggest shift came in 1958 when the Brooklyn Dodgers up and moved their team to Los Angeles, making for the first MLB franchise on America's West Coast. This move, combined with the Dodgers setting a single-game MLB attendance record in their LA home appearance with over 78,000 spectators, convinced the New York Giants to move their franchise to San Francisco at around the same time. These 2 relocations kickstarted a wave of teams changing their home cities in the 1960s, including the Milwaukee Braves, moving to Atlanta, thus bringing the MLB to the Deep South. As the MLB's popularity continued to grow, both the NL and AL began adding expansion teams, including the NL adding the first Canadian franchise, the Montreal Expos, in 1969. While the 1960s were mostly pitcher-dominant, although not as much as the dead ball era, the AL sought to change that in 1973 when they introduced the designated hitter, or DH rule, which took until 2022 for the NL to adopt. Who wants to see pitchers hitting anyways? The MLB's other biggest development in the 1970s was the shift to sharing multi-purpose stadiums with NFL franchises and the increased usage of artificial turf fields rather than natural grass. While some baseball traditionalists still believe that MLB fields should remain all natural, groundskeepers surely aren't complaining. The MLB's biggest story in the 1980s came when Pete Rose, the MLB's all-time hits leader, became the first person to receive a lifetime ban from the MLB after he was caught betting on the Cincinnati Reds, who he was the manager for, to win. In the 1990s, MLB players commonly began hitting 40 to 50 home runs in a season, which was an extremely rare feat just a decade before. This roused some suspicions about how these players were able to produce such high power, seemingly out of nowhere. This suspect power surge led to many of the game's best players, such as Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, and Jose Canseco, to name just a few, being caught using steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs, which led to the MLB instituting much stricter drug testing rules. Although some fans still argue that juiced-up players hitting 500-foot home runs is more entertaining to watch and is therefore better for the game, we'll let you form your own opinion on that one. Which brings us to the MLB's modern era, which can be encapsulated by one word: technology. The advent of technologies such as StatCasts, as well as the understanding and usage of advanced statistics to construct and manage teams. Think Moneyball. MLB teams can now assess a player's strengths and weaknesses way better than before, which has enabled the game to become faster, stronger, and more athletic. Another seismic shift to the game occurred in 2023, when the MLB announced the introduction of a pitch clock, which would have been considered sacrilege just a decade before. Yet after fans and players realized that this clock would cut off nearly 30 minutes of average game time to games, the complaints ceased. And that brings us to today. While seeing how the MLB has continued to evolve over the years, you might have noticed a common thread. Much of these evolutions came as a result of something, well, bad. Whether that be teams losing the World Series on purpose in exchange for some extra cash, no runs being scored, no black players being allowed entry, or juiced-up sluggers demolishing fastballs seemingly every game, much of the MLB's history is rooted in negative developments. Yet, while the MLB, and baseball as a whole, is often considered a change-resistant, this video shows that the league can recognize when it needs to adapt, and usually makes the right changes and updates in order to ensure the game keeps growing. The MLB is by no means perfect, but it never has been, and has still come this far. Who knows what we might see next on the MLB's horizon? Robotic players? Weightless baseball gloves? Whatever it is, we can expect the league and the sport to find a way to make it work.